You want to know the one place on Earth that has humiliated every superpower that ever walked this planet. I'm talking about a landlocked country roughly the size of Texas that has made empires crumble, generals weep, and world leaders question every decision that brought them there. For 2,500 years, the greatest military minds on the planet have marched into Afghanistan thinking they would be different, thinking their technology would be better, their strategy smarter, their soldiers tougher, and for 2,500 years, every single one of them has been wrong. This is the story of why no one can conquer Afghanistan. So let's start with the most obvious question. What makes this place so special? Why can't anyone hold it? The answer starts with geography, but it definitely doesn't end there. Picture this. Son, you've got the Hindu Kush mountain range slicing right through the middle of the country like a jagged spine. These aren't your regular mountains. We're talking peaks that reach over 7,000 meters high, some of the most brutal terrain anywhere on the planet. The highest point is Tyra Ymir at 7,708 meters, which is almost as tall as K2. Now, imagine trying to move an army through that. Imagine trying to supply troops when the only paths are narrow mountain passes that become completely impassable in winter. The Greeks who arrived with Alexander the Great 2,000 years ago took one look at these mountains and called them the edge of the world because they genuinely believed civilization ended here. The terrain does something to invading armies that no enemy soldier ever could. It breaks their supply lines. It exhausts their troops before battle even begins. It gives defenders 1,000 places to hide while attackers have nowhere to run. Every valley becomes a potential ambush. Every mountain pass becomes a choke point where a few hundred local fighters can hold off thousands of well-equipped soldiers. The Hindu Kush isn't just a mountain range. It's a natural fortress that has protected the Afghan people for millennia. But geography alone doesn't explain everything. You have to understand the people. Afghanistan sits at the crossroads of Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. For thousands of years, it's been a highway for trade, migration, and invasion. Persian armies marched through, Greek armies followed. Mongol hordes swept across. Arab conquerors brought Islam. This constant churning of peoples created a population that is incredibly diverse and fiercely independent. You've got Pashtuns in the south and east, Tajiks in the north, Hazaras in the central highlands, Uzbeks, Turkmens, Balochs, and dozens of other ethnic groups, each with their own languages, their own customs, their own leaders. The one thing they all share is a refusal to be ruled by outsiders. This isn't some romantic notion either. This is practical reality forged over centuries of dealing with invaders. Afghan society is built around tribal loyalty, not national identity. When a foreign army shows up, these tribes might fight each other constantly, but they will unite against the outsider. And once that outsider is gone, they go right back to their own internal disputes. This makes Afghanistan impossible to govern the way you govern a normal country. There's no single leader you can overthrow to take control. There's no capital you can capture to win the war. Every village, every valley, every mountain community is its own fortress that must be conquered individually. Now let's get into the actual history because this is where it gets really interesting. The story begins around 330 BCE with Alexander the Great. At this point, Alexander had already crushed the Persian Empire. He defeated Darius III in battle and was essentially the most powerful man in the known world. His army had swept across modern-day Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, and Iran with relative ease. When he entered what is now Afghanistan, he expected more of the same. Quick victories, local leaders submitting, and then onward to India. He was dead wrong. Alexander spent 2 agonizing years in Afghanistan, longer than he spent conquering all of Persia. His army crossed the Hindu Kush in brutal conditions. Men froze to death on the mountain passes. Supplies ran out in the desert regions of the north. The heat was so intense that soldiers collapsed from exhaustion before they even reached battle. Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus wrote about how the lack of water was so severe that desperation produced a parching thirst before a natural craving to drink appeared. For 75 kilometers, there was no trace of water to be found, but the land was only part of the problem. The real nightmare was the people. Alexander faced guerrilla warfare unlike anything he'd experienced before. Local tribes would attack his supply convoys, and then melt back into the mountains before his troops could respond. One classical historian compared the Afghan fighters to a hydra from Greek mythology. Every time Alexander cut off one head, three more grew in its place. Alexander caught his main target, a man named Bessus, who had murdered the Persian Emperor Darius and declared himself king. Bessus was captured, tortured, and executed. Mission accomplished, right? Not even close. A local leader named Spitamenes launched a rebellion that nearly destroyed Alexander's army. Macedonian garrisons were overwhelmed. Troops that had conquered empires were suddenly fighting for their lives against fighters who knew every rock and every cave in those mountains. The turning point came when Spitamenes ambushed a relief force Alexander had sent to rescue a besieged garrison. It was one of the worst defeats of Alexander's entire campaign. He had to bring in 20,000 reinforcements just to stabilize the situation, troops that were originally meant for his invasion of India. Alexander eventually adapted, dividing his forces into smaller mobile units that could respond to guerrilla tactics. He built fortresses throughout the region. He even married Roxana, the daughter of a local warlord, partly for love but mostly for political alliance. In the end, Alexander left Afghanistan nominally conquered, but never truly controlled. Rebellions began almost the moment he departed. His successors struggled to hold the territory for decades before local powers reasserted themselves. The greatest conqueror in ancient history had met his match. Fast forward about 1,500 years to the Mongol invasion. Genghis Khan arrived in Afghanistan around 1219, and his approach was very different from Alexander's. The Mongols didn't come to conquer and rule. They came to destroy. The trigger was the murder of a Mongol trade caravan by a local governor who refused to acknowledge Mongol authority. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors to demand justice, the local Shah killed one of them and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a deliberate insult. This was a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Genghis Khan unleashed more than 200,000 soldiers into Afghanistan and the surrounding regions. Cities like Herat, Balkh, Ghazni, and Bamiyan were systematically destroyed. The Mongols weren't interested in winning hearts and minds. They massacred entire populations as a deliberate strategy to prevent future rebellions. Historians estimate that between 2 and 15 million people died during the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, which included most of Afghanistan. But even the Mongols faced resistance. At the Battle of Parwan in 1221, a Khwarezmian prince named Jalal al-Din actually defeated a Mongol army of 30,000 troops. It was one of the rare times anyone beat the Mongols in open battle during Genghis Khan's reign. The victory inspired rebellions across the region. Cities that had already surrendered to Mongol rule rose up in arms. Genghis Khan responded with even greater brutality. When his favorite grandson Mutu Khan was killed by an arrow during the siege of Bamiyan, the Khan ordered that every person, every animal, and every living thing in the city be killed. No prisoners were taken. No plunder was allowed. The city was simply wiped from existence as an act of pure vengeance. The Mongols eventually controlled Afghanistan, but their rule was never stable. The moment central authority weakened, local resistance re-emerged. The pattern that Alexander had established continued. You could conquer Afghan cities. You could devastate their populations, but you could never make them submit. Then came Tamerlane in the 1380s. This Turco-Mongol conqueror saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan and set out to build an empire just as vast. His armies caused devastation that historians estimate killed 17 million people across Central Asia. Afghanistan suffered terribly, with thousands slaughtered and an equal number of women enslaved. Tamerlane destroyed irrigation systems that had sustained communities for generations, turning fertile regions into permanent desert. Some areas never recovered. Now we get to the modern era, and this is where the phrase graveyard of empires really takes hold. The British Empire in the 19th century was the most powerful force on the planet. They controlled India, they controlled global trade routes, and they were deeply paranoid about Russian expansion into Central Asia. Afghanistan sat right between British India and the expanding Russian Empire. The British saw it as a buffer zone that absolutely had to be kept friendly. In 1839, they decided to invade. The British Army of the Indus was massive. About 21,000 troops plus 38,000 camp followers, 30,000 camels, and herds of cattle. British officers brought personal servants, fine wine, and even foxhounds for hunting. The one senior officer required 60 camels just to carry his personal belongings. They marched into Afghanistan expecting a quick campaign. Initially, everything went according to plan. The British captured Kandahar without a fight. They stormed the fortress of Ghazni. They took Kabul and installed their preferred ruler, a former king named Shah Shuja, on the throne. Victory seemed complete. Then everything fell apart. The Afghan population despised Shah Shuja. Resentment against the British occupation grew. Prices rose, taxes increased. Local tribal leaders who had been bought off started switching sides when British funds ran low. By 1841, rebellion was spreading throughout the country. British officers were assassinated in the streets of Kabul. The main political representative, Sir William McNaughton, was killed during negotiations. His body dragged through the streets and his head displayed as a trophy. The British decided to retreat in January 1842. About 4,500 troops and 12,000 camp followers marched out of Kabul with promises of safe passage. It was a death march. Afghan fighters harassed the column from the moment it left the city. The cold was brutal. Supplies ran out almost immediately. The promised escort never materialized. Day after day, fighters swarmed the column from the surrounding hills, picking off soldiers with long-range rifles called Jazales that outranged British muskets. The retreat turned into a massacre. By the time the survivors reached the Gandamak Pass, only a handful remained. On January 13, 1842, a single figure on a dying horse appeared at the British garrison in Jalalabad. His name was Dr. William Brydon, an army surgeon. He was the only survivor of the entire column to reach safety. The image of that lone rider became one of the most iconic representations of imperial failure in British history. The British returned later that year with an army of retribution. They burned the bazaar in Kabul, freed prisoners, and then left. Their puppet king was assassinated. The original ruler they had overthrown came back to power. 4 years of war had accomplished exactly nothing. The British tried twice more over the following decades. The Second Anglo-Afghan War from 1878 to 1880 achieved some limited objectives but again ended with British withdrawal. The Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 resulted in Afghan independence from any British control whatsoever. The lesson was clear. You could win battles in Afghanistan. You could take cities. You could not hold the country. Then came the Soviets. In December 1979, the Soviet Union sent about 30,000 troops into Afghanistan to prop up a communist government that was collapsing under the weight of rural rebellion. The Soviets thought they could stabilize the situation quickly. They were backed by the most powerful military machine on Earth. They had tanks, helicopters, modern weapons, and complete air superiority. They stayed for 10 years and never came close to winning. The pattern repeated yet again. Soviet forces controlled the cities. The Mujahideen controlled the countryside. Convoys were ambushed on mountain roads. Outposts were overrun. The Soviets tried everything. They bombed villages suspected of supporting the resistance. They depopulated entire regions to deny the guerrillas civilian support. They killed between 1 and 3 million Afghans. They created a refugee crisis that displaced millions more into Pakistan and Iran. Nothing worked. The Mujahideen received weapons and training from the United States, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and other countries. When they got shoulder-fired, Stinger missiles capable of bringing down Soviet helicopters, the war changed completely. The Soviets lost their air superiority advantage. Their casualties mounted. The war became increasingly unpopular at home. The Soviet withdrawal began in 1988 and was completed in February 1989. The government they had supported collapsed 3 years later. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, and many historians believe the Afghan War played a significant role in that collapse. The economic cost, the military drain, the loss of international prestige all contributed to the Soviet system's final breakdown. Afghanistan had claimed another empire, and then came America. Following the September 11th attacks in 2001, The United States invaded Afghanistan to destroy al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban government that had sheltered them. The initial campaign was remarkably successful. Within weeks, the Taliban regime collapsed. Major cities fell. A new government was installed. Osama bin Laden fled into the mountains and eventually into Pakistan. Then the mission changed. Nation building, democracy promotion, training Afghan security forces. The war expanded from a targeted counterterrorism operation into a sprawling attempt to remake Afghan society. 20 years later, the United States withdrew. The Taliban immediately launched an offensive. But the Afghan government that America had spent 2 decades supporting collapsed in a matter of weeks. By August 2021, the Taliban controlled Kabul. The last American military flight left on August 30th. Images of desperate Afghans clinging to departing aircraft became symbols of another imperial failure. The war cost the United States over $2 trillion. More than 2,300 American military personnel died. Thousands of military contractors died. Over 1,100 allied troops from other NATO countries died. At least 46,000 Afghan civilians were killed. Roughly 70,000 Afghan military and police died fighting the Taliban. The Taliban are now running the country they controlled in 2001, before America arrived. So what does this all mean? Why does Afghanistan keep defeating the most powerful armies in history? Part of it is geography. The terrain makes conventional warfare incredibly difficult. Supply lines are vulnerable. Large military formations can't operate effectively in mountain environments designed by nature for guerrilla warfare. Part of it is culture. Afghan society is decentralized in ways that make occupation nearly impossible. There's no single capital to capture, no single leader to overthrow, no unified population to pacify. Every valley is its own fortress. Every tribe has its own loyalties. Part of it is timing. Invaders get tired, their publics lose patience, their treasuries run dry. Afghans, on the other hand, are fighting for their homes. They can wait, they can endure. They know that eventually the foreigners will leave. But perhaps the most important factor is that foreign powers consistently misunderstand what they're getting into. They believe their superior technology and training will overcome local resistance. They install governments that lack popular legitimacy. They make promises they cannot keep. They try to impose order on a society that has resisted centralization for millennia. Afghanistan is not impossible to conquer in a military sense. Alexander took cities. The Mongols devastated populations. The British won battles. The Soviets controlled urban areas. The Americans achieved tactical victories, but none of them could translate military success into lasting political control. The lesson of Afghan history is not that the people are somehow superhuman warriors, though they have certainly produced formidable fighters. The lesson is that occupation is a different problem than invasion. Winning battles is easier than winning peace. And when you're fighting a population that refuses to accept foreign rule, time is always on their side. Afghanistan sits today under Taliban rule. Its economy shattered, its population struggling. The country that has defeated so many empires remains one of the poorest and most unstable places on earth. The graveyard of empires has buried many invaders, but the cost of that resistance has been borne by the Afghan people themselves. Every generation of military planners looks at Afghanistan and thinks they will be the exception. They study the failures that came before. They develop new strategies. They deploy new technologies. And every generation learns the same lesson that Alexander learned over 2,000 years ago. You can enter Afghanistan. You can win battles. You can take cities. But you cannot stay. The mountains are too harsh. The people are too stubborn. The land itself refuses to be tamed. That is why no one can conquer Afghanistan. And that is why, despite everything that has happened, they keep trying.